Okay, so today we're going to look at consumer learning and various theories involved in that. Uh, Obviously, we're looking at consumer behavior. And so within this topic, we are going to discuss the elements of learning relevant to consumer behavior. We're going to explain cognitive, behavioral, and observational learning theories, understand the role of memory in learning, and examine methods used to measure consumer learning, and then looking at why people forget. And obviously, within all of this, we're going to bring it back to how is this relevant to marketing? So elements, let me just make that a little bit bigger. Elements of, is that not making, elements of consumer learning to note. So while learning is all pervasive in the lives of consumers, we're learning all the time. There's no single theory of how people learn. From a marketing perspective, however, consumer learning, remembering our brands, our products, remembering that they liked them the last time they used them, that sort of thing. Consumer learning can be thought of as a process by which individuals acquire the purchase and consumption knowledge and experience that apply to future related behavior. It's clear that learning is a process. That is, it continually evolves and changes as a result of newly acquired knowledge, which may be gained from all outside sources or from our own experience. Individuals can learn by observing, also when they're not trying. So consumers recognize many brand names and can hum many product jingles for products they don't even use. This unintentional acquisition of knowledge is known as incidental learning. So when analyzing the topic of learning, consumer researchers typically discuss two types, cognitive learning and behavioral learning. So cognitive learning, theorists focusing on cognitive learning focus on relatively complex forms of learning, such as how people retain verbal material, so the message in the advertisement, how people have insights, how people plan, and as such, most cognitive, so cognitive are the processes going on in our brains, most cognitive theorists view learning as occurring through information processing, which is the process through which consumers are exposed to information, attend to it, comprehend it, and place it in the memory, and then retrieve that information for later use. Behavioral learning had been defined as a process in which experience with the environment leads to relatively permanent change in behavior or the potential for change in behavior. This also suggests that behavior is primarily made in response to external stimuli. So there are two types and put forward by different theorists, and they're not in conflict with each other. Both can go on in the same person. So the concept of motivation is important to learning theory. Motivation is based on needs and goals and acts to spur learning. It's the motive that arouses individuals and thereby increases their readiness to respond. This arousal is essential as it activates the energy necessary to engage in learning activity. Any success in achieving the motivating goal, however, tends to reduce arousal. So this is reinforcement and will create a tendency for the same behavior to occur again and again in a similar situation. So this is why companies attempt to have their products or names available when the consumer's motives are aroused. So Flavins, hot cereal is promoted during the winter months, whereas ice cream is heavily promoted during summer. So it's at that time when that motive is aroused and we can satisfy that. So if motives serve to stimulate learning, cues are that stimulus, the stimuli that give direction to these motives. Cues can influence the manner in which consumers respond to the motive. An ad is the cue or stimulus that suggests a specific way to satisfy motive. Marketers use place, price, styling, packaging, and store displays as cues to help consumers fulfill their needs in product-specific ways. The cues serve to direct consumer drives when they are consistent with consumer expectations. Marketers must be careful to provide cues that do not upset those expectations. For example, consumers expect designer clothes to be expensive and to be sold in upscale retail stores and advertise only in upscale fashion pages. Still, we refer to those pages as magazines and include the hard copy old-fashioned style too. So with designer clothes, if they were suddenly being sold as in a corner of pennies, that's a mismatch in the expectation of consumers and it would devalue that brand in that case. So this response then is the mental or physical activity consumers make in reaction to the cue. So appropriate responses to particular situations are learned over time through experience. If a prior experience of a particular store was not good, the consumer will ignore that store in future. This means that there's no observable behavior. The consumer just doesn't go back there. So cues provide some direction, but there are many cues competing for the consumer's attention. Now, I know we're going through a lot of terminology, but like any topic, and in particular this one, we're learning a lot of psychology terms, and we have to get on the same page before we can move on from that. So reinforcement then increases the likelihood that a specific response will occur in the future as a result of a particular stimuli. So it's that repetition. When marketers provide positive reinforcement in the form of a reward, the response is strengthened and appropriate repeat behavior is learned. So when Boots number 7, Protect and Perfect anti-wrinkle serum was launched back in 2007, it sold out in days after independent scientists said it was as effective as other products available on prescription from a doctor. So basically, this much cheaper version, instead of paying 60, 50, 60, 70 quid to visit the doctor and then pay for whatever is prescribed, you can just go to Boots and buy this particular one. So negative reinforcement also strengthens responses so that appropriate behavior is learned. Marketers can attempt to provide reinforcement by reducing motive arousal. They can achieve this by removing a negative reinforce. So, for example, Benylin cough mixture removes the cough, which is a negative thing for the customer. So it stresses in their marketing, they stress fast relief, and that is removing the negative reinforcement of the unpleasant cough in that case. So you can read some of these mini case studies yourselves. So just pause the recording and you can read it. And the final part is there. So again, you can pause that and read it in your own time. So cognitive learning theory approaches focus on the importance of internal mental processes. So again, it's that working of the brain, the logical functioning and processing. So considerable amount of learning takes place as the result of consumer thinking and problem solving. Cognitive learning theory holds that the kind of learning most characteristic of human beings is problem solving, which enables individuals to gain some control over their environment. Cognitive learning also focuses on the mental activities such as thinking, remembering, developing insight, forming concepts, and learning ideas. Thus, cognitive learning is an active process in which consumers seek to control the information obtained and feel in control, making their own decisions, their own conscious decisions. So how people learn in the consumer environment is an important issue for marketers, obviously. It has been suggested that consumers learn through education and through experience. So learning through education involves obtaining information from companies in the form of advertising, sales personnel, consumers' own directed efforts to seek data. So looking up the website, reading reviews, whatever it is. Consumers process product information by attributes, brands, comparison between brands, or a combination of all. The more experience a consumer has with a product category, the greater his or her ability to make use of product information. Greater familiarity with the product category also increases cognitive ability and learning a new purchase decision, particularly regarding technical information. So learning through experience involves the process of gaining knowledge through direct contact with the products. Overall, learning from experience is a more effective means of gaining consumer knowledge. You know yourself, if you've used a particular brand, you've had a particular laptop before, a particular brand of mobile phone, the next time you need to upgrade, you're going to draw on that experience. Did you like that? Did you find that laptop good compared to what you saw other people using, and which they probably bought for roughly the same price, and so on? You use your own experience. Um, So it promotes better retrieval and recall because consumer is involved in the learning experience and the information obtained is more vivid, concrete, and salient. Obviously, you trust your own memory and so on, your own experience. Greater familiarity with the product category also increases cognitive ability and learning during the new decision, particularly with regard to technical information. And some consumers learn by analogy. That is, they transfer knowledge about products they are familiar with, other products, to the new and unfamiliar products in order to enhance their understanding. So similar products, perhaps, or whatever it is. So moving on, so that was cognitive learning theory, and now we look at behavioral learning theories. So researchers have identified three major approaches to behavioral learning. We have classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and vicarious, or also called observational learning. So let's look at classical conditioning, and we'll expand on the next slide or so. So classical conditioning is where behavior is influenced by a stimulus that occurs prior to the behavior and elicits it in a manner that has the appearance of being a reflex. We'll see what that means in a second. Operant conditioning, behavior is influenced by the consequences of the behavior. And then finally, vicarious learning or observational learning occurs when individuals observe the actions of others and model or imitate their actions. So we learn by other people's mistakes. That's part of that. You might have heard that the word vicarious is often used when people say they're living vicariously through someone else. And that means someone else is having a fun life or doing something fun, and they are enjoying hearing about it or seeing it or whatever, as if they themselves were experiencing it. So living through that other person. So behavioral learning theories are sometimes referred to as stimulus response theories because they're based on the premise that observable responses to specific external stimuli signal that learning has taken place. When an individual responds in a predictable way to a known stimulus, he or she is said to have learned. So let's look at classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, behavior is influenced by a stimulus that occurs prior to the behavior and elicits it in a manner that has the appearance of being a reflex. It's also called respondent conditioning. In the process of classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus is paired with a stimulus that elicits the response. So through a repetition of that pairing, the neutral stimulus takes on the ability to elicit the response. I'm just going to click ahead to see, do I have a slide on Pavlov or will I just talk about it? Oh yeah, I do have a slide on Pavlov. I couldn't remember. Am I just going to waffle it? Okay, so we'll talk about Pavlov in a second. You probably have heard the story. So classical conditioning theorists regard all organisms, whether it's human or other animals, as passive entities that can be taught certain behaviors through repetition, and that's the conditioning. That's what conditioning means. In classical conditioning, behavior is, sorry, that didn't move ahead, did it? I've got some repeat slides. No, just didn't move on. Okay, so Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist working in the 1920s, was the first to describe conditioning and to propose it as a general model of how learning works. So according to Pavlovian theory, as it's now called, conditioned learning results when a stimulus that is paired with another stimulus that elicits the known response serves to produce the same response when used alone. He demonstrated what he meant in his studies with his dogs. So the dogs were at a certain time every day, the dogs are hungry, obviously before they're going to be fed. So at that point, they're highly motivated to eat. In his experiments, he rang a bell. So it's a stimulus that doesn't normally do anything. That's what we mean by a neutral stimulus. Ringing a bell, it's nothing to do with how our body works or what we think about food or eating or whatever. So it's a neutral stimulus. We can hear it. So it's a stimulus. So he sounded a bell and immediately applied a meat paste to the dog's tongue. So obviously dogs like meat. It's something tasty and it made them salivate. These were dogs that do salivate quite easily. So it was easy to measure. Beagles, I think they were. So when he rang the bell, he put the meat paste in their mouth and that made them salivate. And he did this repeatedly at the same time, over a long period of time. So learning or the conditioning occurred when after a sufficient number of repetitions of the bell, followed almost immediately by the food, the sound of the bell alone caused the dogs to salivate. So the bell took on the active stimulating effect. So marketers are particularly interested in the study of classical conditioning. They attempt to identify stimuli, sort of messages, sights, and sounds that will elicit positive reactions from consumers. And that positivity will hopefully become associated with their brand. So their goal is to associate their product or service with that positive stimulus so that the product will elicit a similar positive reaction when the consumer thinks about or encounters it, sees it in a shop, in other words, or whatever, online. The basic form of classical conditioning demonstrated by Pavlov focuses on cues that induce hunger, thirst, and other basic drives. In consumer behavior context, when these cues are consistently paired with conditioned stimuli, such as brand names, consumers may learn to feel hungry, thirsty, or aroused when later exposed to the brand cues. Repetition causes the strength of the association between the conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus and slows the process of forgetting. There is a limit, however, to the amount of repetition that will aid retention. So retention is keeping that connection in the brain. So that will aid retention as an individual can become sated with numerous exposures, and both attention and retention will decline. This effect, known as advertising wear out, can be moderated by varying the advertising message. So you may notice in a particular campaign, it might be a big campaign, a big budget campaign, and the message keeps kind of slightly changing, and instead of reusing the maybe old or the earlier videos or whatever it is, it keeps slightly changing, and they're spending an awful lot of money recasting, reshooting new videos to keep changing it over the maybe 6 months of a campaign. And this is what they're trying to avoid. Although a great deal of consumer behavior, for example, purchase of branded FMCGs, is influenced to some extent by repeated advertising messages stressing unique competitive advantage, significant amount of purchase behavior results from careful evaluation of product choices. Consumers' assessments of products are often based on the degree of satisfaction or rewards that consumers experience as a result of making specific purchases. In other words, from operant or instrumental conditioning. So we've got another mini case study looking at credit cards. So credit cards act as conditioned stimuli to elicit buying behavior. So read that. You can pause the recording to read that in your own time. And then the next part, final part, again, pause the recording to read the second part yourselves. And moving on then to operant conditioning. So previously we were looking at classical conditioning, now it's operant, still in behavioral. So operant conditioning, behavior is influenced by the consequences of the behavior and occurs as the individual learns to perform behaviors that produce positive outcomes to avoid those that yield negative outcomes. Like classical conditioning, operant conditioning requires a link between a stimulus and a response. So operant conditioning, the stimulus that results is the most satisfactory response, and that's the one that's learned. So again, sticking with the dog idea, the dog theme in these, if you're toilet training a dog, you start off with a puppy and you start bringing it out every half hour or every hour outside. It's very tedious, and then it will naturally and accidentally just happen to go where you want it to go, and whenever that happens, you lavish praise. Some people use praise, some people use an actual treat, but you know, the praise actually is quite sufficient. And that is the consequence that they actually want to experience again. So they associate going out with getting this praise, and they keep trying to pee in the same place. And so that is operant conditioning in toilet training. Negative side of that could be that whenever the dog goes in the wrong place, some people might use well, back in the day, I think, some dog owners would have been very rough, stories of maybe rubbing a dog's nose in the pee and stuff like that, which it may stop the dog peeing in that place, but actually has other negative consequences psychologically for the dog. So it's the carrot and stick. Carrot always produces better results than the stick in the long term. The stick side of things, the literal and figurative, negative conditioning in this case, has other negative effects as well as what you're trying to achieve. So lavishing the praise or giving the treats when the dog goes outside will ultimately result in the desired behavior that you're looking for. The dog will no longer pee inside because they want to hold it to go outside and get that praise or get that treat. And so they start learning that kind of thing. So operant learning occurs through a trial and error. They keep trying, they keep going. It takes time for a puppy to learn. It takes time for them to actually physically learn to hold it as well. So it's not just that they don't want to. So with habits formed as a result of rewards received for certain responses or behaviors. This model of learning applies to many situations in which consumers learn about product, services, and retail stores, both on and offline. So, for example, consumers learn by shopping in a number of stores, which stores carry the type of clothing they prefer, at prices they can afford, and styles they like, and all that sort of thing, sizes they like. Some stores specialize in some sizes as well. In contrast, responses in classical conditioning are involuntary and fairly simple, while those in operant conditioning are made deliberately to obtain the goal and may be more complex. So according to Skinner, most individual learning occurs in a controlled environment in which individuals are rewarded for choosing an appropriate behavior. In consumer behavior terms, operant conditioning suggests that some purchase behavior will result in more favorable outcomes or rewards than other purchase behavior. And a favorable experience is instrumental in teaching the individual to repeat that behavior. So they get what they want in the store. It's relatively easy to get through checkout and so on. That's a positive outcome. And they may be happy to repeat that. So classical versus operant. Classical conditioning is dependent on an already established response to another stimulus, while operant conditioning requires the learner to discover an appropriate response and therefore involves the learner at a more conscious level than classical conditioning would. While classical conditioning is not dependent on the learner's actions, in operant conditioning, a particular response can change the learner's situation. So the response is instrumental in producing reinforcement, hence the name instrumental or operant conditioning. So vicarious then was the final one of three. Vicarious or observational learning, another approach to learning, examines how aspects of cognitive learning are linked to operant learning. So vicarious learning occurs when people watch the actions of others and note the reinforcements they receive for their behaviors, and then the learning occurs as a result of vicarious rather than direct experience. So seeing what happens with other people, seeing that they got a money back voucher when they shopped in a particular store. I want to get that too. I'll go there. Such actions can range from purchasing a product to learning a skill or avoiding buying drugs, because you see the result in some people. Consumers often observe how others behave in response to certain situations or stimuli, and the ensuing results, the reinforcement that occur. And they imitate or model, as we say in psychology, the positively enforced behavior when faced with similar situations. So role models are usually people an individual admires because of traits such as appearance, accomplishment, skill, and social class, and so on. So accomplishment includes, they could be famous actors or athletes or whatever it is. So consumer models with which the target audience can identify are shown achieving positive outcomes to common problem situations through the use of the advertised product. So this celebrity has dandruff and washes with Head and Shoulders to get rid of it. In order for observational learning in the form of modeling to occur, 4 conditions must be met. Number 1, the consumer's attention must be directed to the appropriate model who, for reasons of attractiveness, competence, status, or similarly, it's desirable to emulate that person in some way. So number 2, the consumer must remember what's said or done by the model, remember what the ad is about. Number 3, the consumer must convert this information into actions and so be likely to buy that product. So again, if they have problems with dandruff, that they will go and buy Head and Shoulders or make a decision to buy the next time I'm buying shampoo, I'll get that one, I'll give it a go. And number 4, that the consumer must be motivated to actually do it, to follow through and do it. So again, another mini case study in relation to this point. So example, vicarious learning with role model Paura Carrington and Flora Margarine. So, it's totally unrelated to golf, but, he tells the story of how he had high cholesterol and uses their lower cholesterol, can't say it, cholesterol lowering product to get it under control and sort himself out. So you can, pause it on each page. There's the final page and read it for yourselves. So the role of memory in learning. A basic concern for most cognitive scientists is how information is stored in memory, how it's retained, and then how it's retrieved. So memory control processes are methods of handling information that operate consciously or unconsciously to influence decoding, placement, and retrieval of information. Consumers process product information by attributes, brands, comparison between brands, or a combination of those. So we know this already. Because information processing occurs in those stages, it's generally believed that there are separate and sequential storehouses in the memory, like filing cabinets, if you want to think of it that way, where information is kept temporarily for further processing, or folders. So we've got a temporary folder. So these are sensory memories, one folder, short-term memories, another folder, and long-term memory is another folder. So sensory folder, the sensory memory, all data comes to individuals through their senses, through the touch, through sight, through hearing, and so on, other processing. So the senses, however, do not transmit whole messages as a camera does. Instead, each sense receives a fragmented piece of information, the smell, the color, the shape, and transmits it to the brain in parallel. So there's all these different messages shooting up to the brain, and where the perceptions of a single instant are synchronized and perceived as that single image in a single moment in time. So there are lots of different messages that make up that capture that memory. So the image of a sensory input lasts for just a second or two in the mind's sensory store. If it's not processed, it's lost immediately. So for marketers, this means that although it may be relatively easy to get information into your customer's sensory store, it's difficult to make that lasting impression. Although the sensation would only last for a few seconds in the sensory memory, it would be sufficient to allow an individual to determine if he or she should investigate further. So it has a function there. If it's important, the brain, you know, thinks about it further. If it's not important, poof, gone. If the information is retained for further processing, so the brain has decided this is pertinent information, this is something important, it passes through an attentional gate and it's transferred to the short-term memory. So we were in sensory memory and it's moving into short-term, which despite the name is a little longer than sensory memory, which is just instant. So short-term memory also stores information for a limited period of time and its capacity is limited. So working memory, which is another term for short-term memory because it's constantly processing, implies that individuals actively process information in this memory stage. The information is stored by combining small pieces into large pieces known as chunking. So it's all these different instances and different packages coming from your sensory memory. They're packaged together in this chunk of data. So a brand name could be a chunk that summarizes a great deal of detailed information about the brand. So we have said, you know, going back over previous modules and so on, how branding is so important and it helps consumers shortcut, brain function and it helps them remember more about the brand and so on. And this is how it does that. The brand name is the kind of file name for all of this data that can be kind of chunked together in that folder, a brand name folder. So information overload is used to describe the situation in which more information is retrieved than can be processed in short-term memory. So it's too much coming through, and the brain isn't able to sort it out quick enough. Some of it just gets lost. The sensory memory, it's gone. It doesn't make it over to the other folder. In addition to being unable to process all the information, consumer attention may react to overload by becoming aroused, by becoming more narrowly focusing attention on only certain aspects of incoming stimuli. And those may not be important attributes or whatever, but that's a brain's way of coping with this information overload. So the consumer may simply make a random choice by not buy anything. Too much information, I won't do. Okay, I'm not going to buy that. I'll put it off for another time. Or focus on the wrong product qualities for his or her decision. So one of the functions of short-term memory is to assist in the transfer of information to the long-term memory. And this, as marketers, this is where we want to be. We want to get from the sensory to the short term and then processed into long term. So if the information in the short term memory undergoes the process known as rehearsal, so that is the silent and mental repetition of the information. So every time you think about something, so this is where study comes in. So for your exams, every time you think about something, or essentially rewatch my videos or read the notes, you are laying down a foundation. So every thought process is like a path in the woods. firstly, you start with the woods and there are no paths. And animals or people walking through, you start to see this path. The ground is a little more impacted, and there are less weeds and growth on this particular pathway because people are walking, they're laying down that path every time you walk on it, every time you think about something or study something or go back over, whether you're listening to the audio of the videos or you're reading the notes or whatever it is, every time you're processing the content of the module, you're laying down a new path and a new path every time. And so you can see in paths in the woodland, they become well established, and something that is taught about a lot or referred back to becomes then tarmacked over or cemented or whatever. And some are used so often they become motorways. And you can imagine in 100 years, if humans disappeared off the planet, those pathways in the woods that were just compacted ground have, long since gone, and the motorways in the cities and so on, those, while a bit green and so on, and there might be weeds growing around them, but the motorway is still there and you can still see it. And that's why people with Alzheimer's and other neurological issues in old age, where they lose their memory, they lose their short-term memory. Those long-term memories of their childhood, they can still, they may not remember the faces of their husband or wives or their children. They may not remember that they even have children, but they will remember the color of their dress or trousers on the first day of school, and they'll be able to, have really good detail um, memories of their childhood. And that's because those memories, the foundations of those memories have gone throughout their lives, have been gone over so many times that they are the motorways. So in branding, that's where the repetition comes in. It lays down that pathway, and it's like every time an impulse, a thought process is an impulse. In the brain, it's an electrical impulse. But what happens is that there is like a fatty residue that lays down and protects that nerve. The more times we think about that particular thought, we're going over it and laying down an extra layer of protection on it. And that's how those memories are physically formed. Each memory there is a physical pathway in your brain for it, and we're changing it from a pathway in a field or a wood to something concrete, literally. So if the short-term memory doesn't work properly, it doesn't progress into the long-term memory. So it's so information in the short-term memory undergoes that process known as rehearsal. So it's that repetition that we get. It's transferred, at a certain point, it's transferred into long-term. But if it's not gone over, if you don't think about it, so people might wonder why blackouts happen when people are drunk. It's because they're not laying down. They're in the moment when they're drunk, and they're not actually processing everything that's going on in the normal way. They're kind of skipping ahead, so they're still behaving as themselves and still functioning and so on. But the pathways are not being laid down because the brain is not actually processing with a view to keeping this as a memory, and so it's just gone. It's lost forever. So then, if we have succeeded in transferring through that repetition, we've laid down that pathway that has brought our branding into the long-term memory. So long-term memory has an essentially unlimited capacity to store information. Although it's possible to forget something within a few minutes after the information has reached the long-term memory, it's common for data in long-term memory to last for decades, days, weeks, years, decades, as I said. So the amount of information available for delivery from short-term memory storage to long-term storage. So it's going from one folder into another folder in the brain, essentially. The purpose of rehearsal is to fold information in short-term storage long enough for that encoding to take place, to transfer it. So it's kind of like zipping the file to move it over. And so the way information is mentally programmed or encoded helps to determine how it will be represented in the memory. Encoding is that process by which an individual selects a word, visual image, or jingle to represent that perceived object, and that will help open the zip. So the brand name sometimes, the red color of the Coca-Cola, the jingle, as we say, might trigger it, or a smell sometimes. And that can open that zip file with all that it contains. So that's where people say sometimes smells it can be very evocative. So marketers help consumers to encode brands by using brand symbols. Marketers also realize that learning a picture takes less time than learning verbal information, but both types of information are important in forming our overall mental image. A consumer may process a stimulus simply in terms of its sensory meaning, such as color or shape, and when this occurs, the meaning may be activated when a person sees a picture of that stimulus. Pictures also tend to be more memorable than their verbal counterparts, particularly with low involvement circumstances. So there's very little cognitive, conscious working going on in the brain about that brand. So retrieval is the process by which individuals recover information from that long-term memory. A retrieval cue is the stimulus that facilitates the activation of that memory, so unzipping the file. Retrieval may be hindered by interference. For example, a number of competitive brands in a product category will lower the recall of a specific brand. So if they all sound the same or whatever it is, they all use similar colors, then that's not really going to unlock that zip. Mood can also affect retrieval of information. Being in a positive mood can enhance the recall of stimuli in general, and that's why humor is often used in advertising. So individuals are more likely to recall information consistent with their mood. From a marketing perspective, advertisement can influence a consumer's mood in a positive direction, and then the recall of relevant information may be enhanced when the consumer is feeling good. Okay, so how do we measure their learning? How do we measure if they have learned? For many marketers, the dual goals of consumer learning are increased market share and brand loyal customers. So immediate sales and people who will come back. We don't just want new customers who buy it once and never come back again. We want them to, the ones who do buy it, that increases our market share this year. We want them to keep coming back year on year. So these goals are interdependent. Brand loyal customers provide the basis for a stable and growing market share. And brands with a larger market share have proportionately larger groups of loyal buyers. So they go hand in hand with each other. The marketers focus their promotional budgets on trying to teach consumers that their brands are the best and their products will best solve the consumer's problems and satisfy their needs. Thus, it's important for the marketer to measure how effectively consumers have learned this message. Measures of consumer learning include recognition, recall, and comprehension. So we'll look at these. So recognition tests and recall tests are conducted to determine whether consumers remember seeing the ad. Recognition tests are based on unaided recall. So what ads did you see on such a program? Or they might in a kind of lab situation, they might get participants to watch certain programs and have ad breaks, or just watch a series of ads and so on. And then they ask them to name the brands that they saw or whatever it was. So it's unaided. They're not hinting at what it was they saw. Whereas recall tests recognition tests are based on aided recall, whereas recall tests use unaided. So the conduct of the experiment is the same. They're watching something, but in the questions for recognition tests, they say, did you see an ad for a checklist of various brands? And so they're giving, they're hinting at the ones that they may have seen, and they can say yes or no, or tick the box to say, yes, I saw that, or whatever. And then the unaided means they just ask, what did you see? What brands do you remember from what you saw? In a recognition test, the consumer is shown an ad and asked whether they remember seeing it and can remember any of its salient points. And brand recognition is particularly important for in-store decisions because it helps individuals identify or locate the brands they want to see. So obviously, it replicates aided recall by when they go into the shop, they see all the brands, and so it can trigger something. So there is a parallel there that they're testing. And then logos on brands or packages may be fundamental in enhancing that brand recognition. Grocery shopping frequently involves consumers in that recognition task because, as I said, the brands are already laid out there, and some of them they will recognize as being familiar. They may not be able to put their finger on why they're familiar, but they've seen some ads or something at some point. So recall means that a consumer must retrieve the information from the long-term memory. In recall tests, the consumer is asked whether he or she has read a specific magazine, and that includes the kind of a website, or watched specific video, television show, stream, whatever it is. And if so, whether they can recall the ads seen, the products advertised. So at the start of the YouTube program, the ads during that, the brand, any specific points about the product. So whatever that ad showed. Introducing a surprise element in an ad can be particularly effective in aiding recall, even if it's not relevant to the actual information being presented. In addition, mystery ads in which the brand is not identified until the end of the ad are more effective at building building associations in memory between the product category and that brand, especially in the case of relatively unknown brands.